It is relatively quiet on this day after protesters yesterday stormed Hong Kong's parliament. Beijing this morning slamming the demonstration, saying that protesters trampled the rule of law and are challenging the one country, two systems policy. There was the scene yesterday as protesters broke into Hong Kong's legislative building. Hong Kong has seen massive protests for months over a controversial extradition bill. But tensions boiled over during an annual rally to mark the anniversary of Hong Kong's return to China from Britain. Police used tear gas to disperse the protesters who were still inside the legislature. And as I say now, a day later, a stark difference on the streets of Hong Kong. The city has returned to calm, except the Parliament building is trashed. Crews are working on clearing the broken glass and debris, and lawmakers are calling the building a crime scene. Our Asia correspondent, Sasha Petrusik, is following the story for us from Beijing. And Sasha, what more is China saying today about the demonstrations yesterday?
Well, Heather, China has not actually come forward. The government itself hasn't released anything itself, but we're getting much of this commentary coming through the state media, which is almost as good as hearing it from the government. As you mentioned, the TV newscasts here have been calling this an undisguised challenge to China. That's what some international commentators have also called it. Perhaps the biggest challenge since the Tiananmen protests here in Beijing some 30 years ago. Others, the newspapers, are denouncing this as mob culture, as aggressive and arrogant, and they're urging a zero-tolerance policy. What that means exactly isn't clear, but perhaps some sort of intervention by the central government. That's unlikely right now. There's no sign that's going to happen because Hong Kong is a semi-autonomous territory of China. But I'm sure that the people here and the leadership just a few blocks away from me are not happy with what they're seeing down there, especially since the government that they put in place was actually one of their own people. That's Carrie Lam and her government, which is not directly elected, but is actually indirectly appointed by Beijing.
Sasha, she held a very early in the morning overnight news conference after all of this happened, also denouncing the protesters. She's come out strongly against these demonstrations. How is she being received both in Hong Kong and there where you are in Beijing?
Well, as I say, from Beijing's perspective, she is their woman. She basically was put in place to administer the colony, and she's seen by many in Hong Kong, even people who support her, really as more of a representative from Beijing to Hong Kong than someone who represents the people of Hong Kong. She's seen as an administrator, perhaps efficient, but somewhat arrogant. And she actually had, at this news conference that you mentioned, she had this to say about the protests last night.
The second scene that we have seen, which really saddens a lot of people and shocks a lot of people, is the extreme use of violence and vandalism by protesters who stormed into the Legislative Council building over a period of time. So this is something that we should seriously condemn, because nothing is more important than the rule of law in Hong Kong.
She's been very defiant throughout all of this, rejecting demands from the protesters to withdraw this controversial law which led to all of this, which would allow extraditions to China, also rejecting demands that she step down. Now, the fact that she's not liked by protesters isn't surprising, but even some of her own supporters now have started to question her leadership skills and her political judgment, because they say, you know, the territory would not be in this kind of a state if she had made some decisions earlier and perhaps better. Heather?
Sasha, thank you very much. Our Asia correspondent, Sasha Petrusik, in Beijing this morning. Let's get back to one of our top stories today. These scenes from Hong Kong, relative calm on the streets today, although with the cleanup, the reminders of the violence that led to the storming of the city's legislature yesterday. It was the day that marked the 22nd anniversary of the former British colony being returned to China. The demonstrators, among other things, frustrated at what they see as a lack of response to their opposition to the controversial extradition bill. They want to see that legislation scrapped entirely, not just suspended. Riot police, as you see in these pictures, using tear gas to break up the 3-hour occupation of the Legislative Council building. Edward Chan was on our program yesterday, a Canadian who lives in Hong Kong. He was at the protest, and he's back with us this morning. Edward, a pleasure to meet you. I missed your conversation yesterday, so I'm happy to have a chance to say hello to you and welcome you back to the program. Good morning. Can you tell me, can you give me a sense? I can see at your window you're getting a bit of a survey of what's happening. I'm wondering, we were just showing some scenes of cleanup and relative calm, but what have you seen in Hong Kong so far today?
I think today, obviously, they're having a lot of mixed feedback based on what has happened last night at Lachko. Some of the people, obviously, a lot of Hong Kong people, they want to have like a clean sheet. When you talk about all these protests, they want to have a very peaceful one and all against violence in certain aspects. No matter what, they think that young people or protesters, they shouldn't use any violence. But obviously the other side, and also there's a lot of commentators and articles being written today, and people just think about we should be very focused. We shouldn't be diversified to criticize the protesters, but we should continue to look at the issues which was caused by the government. And also because of the Chief Executive, Carrie Lam, she does not reply to any of the requests coming from the Hong Kong people in a positive way. So today, I think the atmosphere is still very kind of like different size feedbacks. And unfortunately, I would say Hong Kong society is getting to be very, very extremely polarized at this moment.
Well, I was going to ask, obviously, as you say, the response is divided. I'm wondering about the protesters themselves. As you suggest, these protests have been largely peaceful to this point. And then there was this violent splinter group yesterday. How much support does that violent group enjoy, or is the protest now divided?
I think a lot of people is getting more and more understandable in terms of why the young people would like to do that. There's a lot of reasons behind that, but I guess it's because you can see that for the past months, Hong Kong people has tried many peaceful ways, including a few times of protests, 1 million to 2 million. And then ultimately, it seems to that all the people, especially young guys, they're very frustrated. They think that the government basically ignore all their requests. So there's no other way to do this on a very peaceful manner. And then this is sort of like a last resort that they have to break into the Lachko building. So I think like at this stage, there's lots of news just trying to spin around, especially I think some of the international news just focus on all the sort of like the acts that are conducted by the protesters. But more locals are getting more and more understandable. They understand why the young people are trying to do that.
Something or someone who is not ignoring these protesters anymore, central government in Beijing. We're hearing from state media today, Edward, as you maybe have heard, denouncing the protests, calling for zero tolerance, whatever that means. How do you interpret what's coming out of Beijing now?
Well, I think this is something that we still have to wait and see. A lot of people predicted that President Xi is going to be getting more and more stringent in terms of the control of the Hong Kong political situation. I guess this is the gesture that they have to make. They have to make sure that the SAR government, they will continue with the power, and they don't want any protesters or any sort of like pro-democracy groups to gain advantage. So I think this is still like among the societies, the atmosphere is very intense, I have to say.
I'm wondering not just about consolidating power, but this is seen by many as a real challenge to President Xi's image as a strongman, and whether or not these protests, if they continue and they grow, whether that's not going to force him to respond in some way.
That's correct. That's correct. I guess a lot of protesters, we are not against the central government. We are just requesting the Hong Kong SAR government to provide a positive feedback and also to set up a separate independent commission to investigate any excessive force used by the police. I think these are very, very humble requests. And that's why, lots of Hong Kong people are just get more and more angry and also frustrated, because even for humble requests, the government choose not to respond.
Okay. And yet it seems that there's more than just a humble request over this legislation. If you watch those protesters yesterday, they got into the legislature, Edward, they hung the colonial flag, they talked about wanting U.S. intervention and help. And it seems perhaps more and more that there's some sort of almost a culture clash happening there. Is there something more going on here at the core?
I think there's always a conflict or cultural difference between Hong Kong and also mainland China. It's all because of the historical issues. I think at this stage, it's like you've probably seen a lot of advertisement being posted in global newspapers. Even in Canada, the Globe and Mail, there's an advertisement talk about last week doing G20. And Hong Kong people are basically asking for the help from the international societies, because Hong Kong is an international city. There's a lot of vested interest coming from different countries, including Canada. So that's why we want to seek help from the international world to understand Hong Kong people's determination to fight for democracies.
Edward, I'm so glad to have had a chance to speak with you personally. We'll stay in touch as this continues. Thank you for the time this morning.
Thank you very much. Thank you.